Well, thank you very much for being here. We're just about a year away from a pivotal election. Now, every election is pivotal, but this one is obviously extraordinarily important. Just as important as the choice we will make and is ensuring that all who are eligible can participate in making that choice. I'm the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act, which was the legislation we passed after the 2000 election. The right to vote is fundamental to our entire system of government, and the ability of every American to have his or her vote and voice heard in Washington and their state and City Hall is critical. Over the course of our history, the right to vote was affirmed through great struggle and sacrifice. And most of the people on this platform, indeed all of the people on this platform, have been involved in that struggle and that advocacy. Today, the right to vote is under threat once again. We are witnessing a concerted effort by Republican lawmakers across several states to place a new obstacle in front of minorities, low-income families, and young people who seek to exercise their right to vote. Across the country, states are trying to make it harder to vote by making identification requirements stricter and reducing early voting. There have also been efforts to deter voter registration. In one Florida high school, a teacher passed out forms to register her voting-age students and now faces a $1,000 fine for failing to make sure election authorities receive them within 48 hours. Obviously nothing to do with the legitimacy of the registration or the timeliness of being able to check them to ensure that they are registered. The League of Women Voters has stopped its registration efforts completely in Florida as a result of the rules like the one I've just referenced. Proponents of these new measures claim they are to counter an epidemic of voter fraud. However, there is simply no evidence of an epidemic of voter fraud. What is evident is that those making the new rules are doing so because of a political agenda. The right to vote does not depend on the politics of the day. Rather, the right to vote is a constitutional and moral right for every citizen. We hold up America as an example for all the world of a free, open nation of laws. We are here today because those who seek to restrict it, the right to vote, ought to know that Democrats are pursuing ways to protect Americans' right to vote. We want every American to know that as well. And we want to hear from them if there are instances of which they know where they or people they know are having impediments put in their way to exercising their right to vote. Democrats are ready to work with public officials of any party to ensure that every person eligible to vote can vote. But we will make a strong stand against any effort to erect barriers that deter Americans from exercising their most fundamental right to be heard. Such efforts are, essentially, a form of voter profiling that makes it more difficult for people of certain groups to participate. This is simply wrong and has no place in an inclusive democracy. We will work closely with the Congressional Black Caucus, represented here by Emanuel Cleaver and others, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, represented by its chairman here, the Honorable Charlie Gonzalez, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, represented by Judy Chu, and the Voting Rights Caucus across the country and voting rights advocacy groups across this country. The right to vote that so many Americans have died for, have fought for, to preserve, is worth fighting for here as well. To that end, we are sending a letter to the Secretaries of State in all 50 states, urging them to oppose these new restrictions on voter access. Empowering people to vote, enhancing their ability to vote, ought to be our agenda, not impeding and undermining their right to vote. Now, I'm proud to be joined today by other Democratic members who have signed this letter. And I want to now turn over the floor to an individual who, among us all, is the giant of protecting people's rights to vote. Last night, he introduced me and he said correctly that he and I have walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge as often as I think he's walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with anybody. And as we did so, I contemplated the courage and risk that he took walking across that bridge, as so many of my colleagues have done as well, to make sure that every American had the right to register, had the right to vote, had the right to have their voice heard in our democracy. A great hero of American democracy, John Lewis. John?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hoyer, for leading this effort to protect free and equal access to the ballot box. Voting rights are under attack in America. Changes to voting laws in as many as 30 states are slowly robbing Americans of basic constitutional right, the right to vote, the right to participate in the democratic process. A new report shows these changes will make it much harder for more than 5 million people to vote in the election of 2012. It's the voter ID laws, proof of citizenship requirement, repeal of early and absentee voting, and purging of voter rolls of people who have paid their debt to society that are stealing away access to the ballot. There's even an attempt to cut Americans from the voting rules who were displaced by the mortgage crisis. That is why we are calling on Secretary of States around the country to use their power and authority to do what is right, what is fair, and what is just. We're encouraging them to use their power to make it simple and easy for people to register to vote. There was a time in this country, not so long ago, when hundreds and thousands of our citizens had to stand in unmovable lines all across the South trying to register to vote. People were beaten, arrested, and even killed trying to defend the right to vote. We must not go back. We want to move forward. That is why we cannot be silent now. That's why we must speak up and speak out. The right to vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society. We must continue to speak up and speak out to protect this simple constitutional right. We hope the people of this country will join us in this call to action to protect free and fair access to the ballot box for all Americans. Again, thank you, Mr. Hoyer. Now it is my pleasure to present Congressman Robert Brady of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Whip Hoyer, for holding this press conference. It's an honor to follow in your footsteps as ranking member of House Administration Committee and to work with you to continue to fight against voter suppression. I see this issue not only as the ranking member on House Administration, but as the chairman of the Philadelphia Party, Democratic Party in the city of Philadelphia. I have a deep understanding for the important role elected officials play and a deeper gratitude for the good work they do. They are the front line of protection for our democracy. Their fight for voting fairness happens before, during, and after Election Day. Before, they must ensure voters have a right and have access to register to vote. During, they must ensure that every eligible voter is able to cast a ballot. And after, they must ensure that every eligible ballot is counted. This is why our letter to each every Secretary of State, signed by nearly every member of our caucus, is so important to me and important to the American people. This letter is the start of a conversation we need to have with other officials. I intend to continue this conversation with members here and on my committee. This is about providing the tools needed for fairly administrating one of the most fundamental rights and to make sure all eligible voters are able to cast a ballot. There is nothing more important, in my opinion, for us to do. Currently in the state of Pennsylvania, there is a voters bill out that says that every person who wants to vote has to get a voter ID, has to get a picture ID for the state of Pennsylvania. This, in my opinion, is an unfunded mandate and a poll tax. It says that people have to pay their own way, whether it be get on a bus, get on a train, whatever it may be, to go to a state agency to be able to acquire this vote. Everyone has to go to the state agency before they can vote. And they are free, but the inconvenience of money it costs to get them are not. I stand there representing the American people and representing the citizens of the people in the 1st Congressional District in the state of Pennsylvania. But most importantly, I stand there representing the most important constituent that I know, my 89-year-old mother. In order for her to be able to vote for me or for anybody that she wants to vote for, she has to get on a bus. Somebody has to take her. She has to be inconvenienced to go and get this voter ID card. That's wrong, and it should not happen, and I will do whatever I can to make sure that it doesn't. I'm pleased to stand here with my colleagues and also to be able to fight for this right issue, to give people the right to vote, and to make it easier. We complain about voter turnout, at least we do in the state of Pennsylvania and across the country. This only suppresses that. We need to make it easier, not harder. So I'm proud to be here, and I'm also proud to introduce a former member, a continuing member of our committee, a hardworking member from the great state of Texas, Charlie Gonzalez.
Thank you, Bob. Well, it's an honor to join my colleagues here today. Throughout the history of the United States, there's always been some sort of a compelling reason to deny people the right to vote, and it's always been the wrong compelling reason. You did it once based on property. You did it once based on race. You did it once based on gender. Had to get a little more sophisticated. You did it once because someone may not be able to read. You did it once because someone maybe couldn't afford $2.50 for a poll tax. We've come a long way. And what are we doing now? We are revisiting that horrible period in the history of this country. The photo ID law in Texas is a great example of that. And it is an extreme example. An emergency, a legislative emergency, had to be declared by our governor, Rick Perry, in order to bypass certain rules so that maybe the minority would not be able to block that kind of legislation in a regular session where it's not declared an emergency. What this law does, in essence, will disenfranchise a certain segment of our community in Texas. Need I tell you what that segment may be? It's going to be the elderly. It's going to be the minorities, of course. It'll be the disabled. That's what we're facing in Texas. In my conversations with the Department of Public Safety, which is the agency tasked with issuing, the only agency tasked with issuing the photo IDs, they will have to do it with the same resources, same number of personnel, the same office hours. None of them are expanded, increased in any way. And there was no money funded for that purpose. The intention is there because we know what communities will be impacted in Texas and what it will be acceptable as a form of ID. I will tell you now, if you're a veteran and you're at the Audie Murphy Memorial Hospital in San Antonio and you have your patient card with your picture and such, that will not be sufficient. If you're a student at the University of Texas in Austin or San Antonio, if you have your student ID, that will not be sufficient. But if you have your concealed handgun ID, that will be adequate. That's where Texas is today. And unfortunately, out of the 12 battleground states in this country, 5 have already enacted similar laws of a different nature maybe as far as whether it's ID or shortening periods of time and so on, and 2 are contemplating that. It's obvious what is going on. Let's not go back to a dark chapter in our history. Let's expand the right to vote. Let's give people a voice in our government. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, dear friend, Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Emanuel Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to question. I don't want to question anyone's motives. I don't know why these impediments for voters are cropping up. Here's what I know. The Reverend Noah Albert Cleaver spent 103 years of his life in Texas, mainly around the Waxahachie, Ennis, Waco area. We can find no record that my great-grandpa, who my children had a chance to know because of his longevity, voted. Why? Well, because it costs money. And if you go back and look in the records, you'll see that Grandpa was an ordained minister / farmer trying to take care of his family. And so to go out and spend $1.50 to vote, which for many in this room is nothing, but back then, and for him, that was a big deal with 4 children. And to think that after all these years and the denial that my grandpa experienced, ashamed I am that in the United States of America, barriers are being placed in front of voters. Ashamed I am that we are spending money and expending energy to help create a democracy in Iraq, trying to encourage the Iraqi people to become Democrats. And yet, the students at Prairie View, A&M University, my alma mater, 40 miles to the south of College Station, cannot use their student ID to vote. And so let's assume a student at Prairie View lives in Amarillo or Lubbock or Odessa in West Texas. Do you understand that's a 600-mile drive to go home to vote? I don't want to say it's intentional. All I want to tell you is that it's a fact. I am convinced that unless we turn this current frenzy around, which is aimed, I think, at least at discouraging voters, and perhaps it's unintentional. I don't know. The people who are doing it would need to answer that question. What I know is that every American ought to be ashamed. Every American ought to be ashamed at what's going on in this country. Grandpa had to pass a literacy test to vote. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? How many seeds are there in a watermelon? I'm not making this up. That's what my grandpa had to face. And I think we've gotten to the point where we won't do that anymore, but we're doing some things that are just as dastardly wrong as what happened to him. Let me introduce my colleague, Judy from the Asian Pacific Caucus.
As chair of the Asian American Caucus, I know how precious the right to vote is. It is because all Chinese immigrants were prohibited by this very Congress from becoming naturalized citizens so that they would not be able to vote. This was a law passed by this Congress through the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And it lasted 60 long years until 1943, and only because the U.S. needed the Chinese as an ally during World War II. This prohibition on the right to vote included my very own grandfather. And so when I turned 18, I decided I had to register to vote and exercise the precious right that had been denied my very own grandfather. Finally, in 1965, a great change occurred for all Americans, the Voting Rights Act, to protect every American from discriminatory voting practices. But this year, this right is being eroded right before our very eyes. An unprecedented 42 bills in states attacking the rights of U.S. citizens. Some states have adopted laws that make it harder to vote by mail, a provision that directly impacts our Asian American voters who vote by mail at nearly twice the rate of non-Asian voters. Voter ID laws would leave out 21 million U.S. citizens who do not have the exact form of ID, including grandmothers who do not drive, college-age students who may not have the right address on their ID card. For the sake of the integrity of the American democratic system, these attacks on voting rights must stop, and I urge all secretaries of state to make sure that voting rights are upheld.
I want to thank all of our speakers. I also want to recognize Congressman Al Green of Texas, Congressman Gene Green of Texas. Not everybody in Texas is named Green, but it so happens these two are. I'm pleased that Betty McCollum of Minnesota is here as well to support this effort, and I appreciate all those who have spoken. Again, I was the sponsor of the Help America Vote Act. One of the provisions of the Help America Vote Act was to allow citizens to cast a provisional ballot so that when they came to the polls, if there was some question, they could cast a ballot to ensure they had that right. And then, out of the somewhat frenzied day of Election Day, they could go back to the election board and make sure that Johnny Smith or Ann Brown were, in fact, registered voters. Why did we conclude that provision? Because we wanted to facilitate, to make sure that every American had the right and could have the ability to cast their vote. We wanted to eliminate any fraud, make sure there was no fraud. And in America today, you don't see throughout this land fraudulent elections. This is a false shibboleth that has been raised against which some are acting, the results of which will be to prohibit Americans from exercising their most precious constitutional right, the right to select their representatives and the policies we pursue. Are there any questions? Jill?
In states like Tennessee, they've passed a voter ID law, but they also are offering free IDs to folks and helping. They have a big campaign going on to educate voters and help them find rides to get those IDs if they need them. Is this something where, just even as a preventative measure against voter fraud, where it's worth it if it can be done in the right way?
Well, I don't know that you heard, who was it that talked to Bob Brady, who's the ranking member on the House Administration Committee, was the chairman of the House Administration Committee, indicated that you're putting up an impediment to solve a problem that we don't believe exists. And that's the issue. And that's why I say it's a windmill that we're tilting at that is not there. So that I think all of us would agree that what you want to do is facilitate, not impede, and the requirement of some photo ID beyond what already exists. For instance, in the state of Maryland, I go into the voter booth, I give them my name. Now, they probably happen to know me, I understand that, but I give them my name, address, and they check my birth date, and then I vote. I don't have to show them anything other than that. I'm on the rolls. And in today's world, with the computers that we have, I'm not going to be allowed to vote anyplace else. So I don't know whether anybody else wanted to comment on that specific question.
Go ahead.
Well,
Betty?
we've had 2 statewide recounts in Minnesota. 2. One for the U.S. Senate and one recently for the governor. And now I tell the elders in my community who maybe don't have a driver's license anymore or who have kept an ID but it's expired because they don't drive anymore. I have a great aunt that's 103. I'm sure she can pull out her driver's license, but she doesn't use it. We've had 2 recounts. Clean bill of health. Now, all of a sudden, I'm telling everybody in my precinct, all my friends, all my neighbors, all the people in Minnesota, you have to prove who you are. Where is the problem? And in Minnesota, there are voter ID laws moving forward claiming that there's some kind of big fraud, big scandal, big abuse of voting. We've had 2 statewide elections that have gone under and through scrutiny and recount by our judiciary system. There is no problem that warrants this kind of action. And that's why I'm here today standing with colleagues from all across this country, making sure every American has the right to vote.
Al Green of Texas would like to say something. Let me just say that I believe it was Reverend Cleaver, Chairman Cleaver, Congressman Cleaver, who said, we're not going to question intent. But whether the intent is there or not, the effect is to more harshly fall on those who have difficulty even getting a free photo ID. Al Green.
Thank you, Mr. Hoyer. With reference to the question, you can call your credit card company and you can transact business without a photo ID. There are other identifiers that can be utilized so as to properly identify you. And if you have in Texas a photo ID and you happen to be a student, that photo ID is not enough. So it's not just a matter of having a photo ID. It has to be a specific type of photo ID. If it's your gun license, then it's a good photo ID. If it's your student ID, it's not enough of an ID. There are other identifiers that can be used and have been used to identify people properly. Final comment. Dr. King said the greatest step a person can take is toward the polls on election day. Isn't it sad that people will show up with voter registration cards and not be able to vote because they don't have a photo ID that is deemed acceptable?
Now, let me say, follow up on that. Martin Luther King, on election day, one thing that's happening in some of these states is the states that have early voting for people who have trouble taking off work on a Tuesday because they lose pay. They may be able to take off legally work, but they lose pay. And so they want to vote on a Saturday or Sunday, and so many states, including my own, have extended early voting opportunities. They are being restricted. That will most harshly impact the least able to take off on a Tuesday to vote. So again, the perverse effect of some of these efforts are clearly designed to reduce the votes, in our opinion, of people more likely than not to vote Democratic.
I'm expecting that you'll get some support from Democrat secretaries of state, and maybe you'll get. First, I guess I'd like to know if you know if you'll get any support from Republicans.
Well, we're just sending the letter. We hope we will. I certainly accept the premise that there are Republican secretaries of state or election administrators. It's not every secretary of state. We're sending to election administrators as well. That there are clearly Republican secretaries of state and administrators who want to facilitate the right to vote.
So take the state of Texas, where you have a long-time Republican administration and the office held by a Republican for a very long time. So Greg Abbott decides not to sign up, then what? And this is a state that's vital, it's important, where you feel like this is an egregious, extreme barrier for voting, then what?
We intend to pursue every avenue including, as I said, working with groups who are specifically focused, both from an advocacy standpoint and from a legal standpoint, of trying to redress any grievance that we find that undermines Americans' right to vote. So that we're going to pursue every avenue. And we're working with groups who have both legal capacity to go to the courts for redress and go to the people for redress.
Last question. Thanks, Mr. Hoyer. Question of identification. Is Grover Norquist some random person? And if not, who is he? Mm-hmm. Grover Norquist, is he some random person, as the speaker said today, or is he something more than that?
I didn't hear what the speaker said, nor did I hear the context of that. But we won't consider that the last question.
Aside from HAVA and the VRA, is there anything you plan to do or can do legislatively?
We certainly, John Conyers could not be here. John Conyers is in a hearing right now. John Conyers was going to be here. None among us has been, as a matter of fact, we might be able to add up some of our service and not have as much longevity as John Conyers. But he is in our group talking about what legislative avenues might be pursued as well. We don't delude ourselves that a party that offered legislation to eliminate the Election Advisory Committee that was set up by the Help America Vote Act so that we could facilitate the best advice and counsel and best practices being conveyed to state administrators of election laws, that a party that sought to eliminate that and to merge it with the FEC, Federal Election Commission, which has nothing to do with the right to vote. It has everything to do with how money is raised to run for election. It was clear that that was an attempt to undermine the focus of the Election Administration Advisory Committee. As a result, I'm not sure that we'll be successful with legislation, but legislation is certainly an option. Thank you all very, very much.
Good job. Good job.